Our guest today is the distinguished composer, pianist, and writer from Britain, Peter Dickinson. Peter is an old friend of the Verdehr Trio. He's written a marvelous piece for us, the American Trio, which is subtitled Hymns, Rags, and Blues. Peter, could you tell us something about your career as a musician, as an administrator, and also I believe you studied in New York at Juilliard, and also about your acquaintance and interaction with some of the important American and British composers of the day.
You know, Walter, I've got to start off by saying how honored I am to be here on this very special day, the day after your election in 2000, and also to be here where you reside, and your marvelous series of 130 commissions at least has been developed and presented all over the world. I'm very honored to be part of that. I've much appreciated your performances, recordings, and it's meant a very great deal to me. My own background that you ask about is that I've been in the university system some of my career, but not all of it. And my connection with American music academically, well, it goes back to the time that I studied at Juilliard, but I started the music department at Keele University in 1974 with its Center for American Music, and then I was in charge of a large department at Goldsmiths College in London University from 1991 until 1997, and now I'm head of music at the Institute of United States Studies, which is within the School of Advanced Studies, a graduate outfit, in London University. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, and you know about this because you gave a marvelous concert for us with Menotti present 3 years ago.
Right. We've performed your work, the American Trio, quite a few times, and the subtitle Hymns, Rags, and Blues gives a good indication of the musical material, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the compositional process and how you came to choose this particular.
Yes. I find
material.
that I got sketches for this kind of a piece back in the 70s. And the idea of hymns, rags, and blues, these are particularly American things with my involvement with American music, but they also go back to my own childhood, because before I could touch the pedals playing the piano, I was accompanying hymn singing in the Sunday school. And the sort of tunes that one heard then are rather comparable to those that inspired Charles Ives and are part of the American Protestant tradition too. So I've got a great affection for that material. And what fascinated me about it is if you put your mind to it, you can turn a hymn tune into a blues, and you can also turn it into a rag. And so you have strands of different kinds of music happening at once. And this intrigued me. Obviously I learnt it from Ives, but I would regard it as something where you have, instead of a three-part counterpoint, that you have three different compositions going on at once. So in the American Trio, you've got blues against a rag and against a hymn, and usually versions of the same material in that different style. It's more complicated than that because I use three different hymn tunes. And the first hymn tune I invented. This was on the model of the very respectable Victorian English composer called John Bacchus Dykes. Imagine what you'd have to do to justify a middle name of Bacchus, with Bacchus as the god of wine. And one of his colleagues was called William Henry Monk. And there was a rhyme that said, William Henry Monk is perpetually in a blue funk when John Bacchus Dykes threatens to take him on hikes. It was John Bacchus Dykes who was very keen on country walks and things like that. And the point of this is that I imitated the style of Dykes's Victorian hymn tunes in the one that I wrote, the main one, for the purposes of this trio. And then, of course, another element of it is the actual performers. I knew a certain amount about what you could do, and I was interested in the medium of violin, clarinet, and piano. I do like things that are a bit out of the way. I'm interested in music which isn't altogether obvious. I like to find things other people don't know about. And so the thought of having an ensemble with those three instruments, but was going to present a piece for that medium when you'd only got Bartok's Contrast, Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat, and a few other pieces, was really very exciting. And I benefited very much, as you'll remember, from coming and going in the discussion with you. I'd done a few things like making the clarinet be too much of a plucked double bass and things like that. And we improved matters by talking. I always like to do that, to discuss things with performers, so they're actually getting a piece that they wouldn't otherwise have got from anybody. Well, I was quite interested in the jazz profile of the clarinet, for example, and the blues potential of instruments that aren't immediately associated with blues, like the violin, as well as the piano ragtime aspects of the piano itself. So in a way we move in and out of this. In a piece which, perhaps I have to stress, it's a 20-minute piece, and you go into it like a kind of dream, and you stay there. And in quite a lot of my larger pieces, such as my concertos, I've been attracted to having a continuous span of music rather than a set of movements so everybody's coughing in between and moving about, so that you can then keep hold of the listener and move, if you want to, from one style to another. I developed the term style modulation for this sort of behavior in composition. After all, we've got Elliott Carter's metrical modulation, and therefore style modulation, to change from styles, is something that I found rather attractive. And in a way, my American trio is perhaps the simplest version of this kind of thing in my music. It's not the only one of my pieces mixed up with ragtime and blues. There was a big piece for organ that was premiered in New York City in the 80s as well. And there's a piece that was written for the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble called London Rags, which contains a ragtime version of what to us is our national anthem, and to you is my country, 'tis of thee.
Peter, you've had a very interesting career. You studied for a while in the United States at Juilliard, as I recall, and then you've had a lot of associations with important American composers.
I did my degree at Cambridge, at Queen's College, Cambridge, where I was an organist. I was organ scholar, which meant I had to play music for college chapel. And then after that, I had the opportunity to study abroad, and I chose the US. A lot of people went to Paris or Rome and so on amongst my contemporaries, but my family had American connections. My father, who was one of the pioneers of the contact lens with other American and German specialists, and he had very many connections in America, and he was very keen that I should go to the US to study. He thought it was a forward-looking thing to do. So I went to Juilliard, and after that I did freelance work in New York City, and then I taught at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey for a year.
Did you get a graduate degree at Juilliard?
I didn't do a degree. No, I simply did exactly what I wanted to do, which meant that I studied composition with Bernard Wagenaar and found William Bergsma very helpful there too. And I was quite interested in some of my contemporaries, who were Philip Glass and also Peter Schickele, who had a terrific sense of humor even then, as you can imagine. And I went to courses in the Graduate School of English at Columbia University, so I made my own package for that purpose. Now, the first important American composer I met was Henry Cowell. And I was simply a graduate student from abroad at an international house up on Riverside Drive, and I found that with some other people from other parts of the world, I was invited to lunch. And I had no idea who Henry Cowell was, but there I was for lunch, and I discovered he was a composer who'd written almost 20 symphonies. And they were a delightful couple. He was very keen on cats, and very keen on Irish whiskey.
Oh, yes. And how old was he at that time? I remember doing a concert of his music at that in the early 60s, but how old was he?
He was in his 60s. Yes. And he was a very generous man. He took an interest in me because I was a composer. Then I went back to New York for my second year, and my music was put on in the Composers Forum series, and I shared one with Donald Liebert. And by this time, it was the worst winter in the East Coast since the Civil War, and Manhattan was closed to traffic for 3 days. And Henry Cowell came to the concert with 2 changes on the subway in that weather, very generously, and spoke to me afterwards. I shall never forget it. As a result of that, I wrote something about his music. I did some broadcast talks in England. And I was interested in the kind of thing he was doing, which was very unusual then and not properly recognized, because he was really writing music that was halfway between East and West traditions. We're more familiar with this now in all sorts of ways, with many Oriental composers working in the US, and Lou Harrison, for example, is another composer who's halfway between East and West, and with West Coast connections too, which Henry Cowell himself had, because as a boy he was taken to Chinese opera and things like that.
And when did Henry Cowell actually write his most significant works? Wasn't it the 20s and 30s? Or?
Well, it's quite difficult. It depends what you want to look at. His most avant-garde music, with tone clusters on the piano, he toured Europe himself in the early 20s. He became so well known for his tone clusters that Bartók asked his permission to use note clusters because he thought that Cowell had invented them. But then he became increasingly drawn to a music of the whole world. But he also developed playing inside the piano before John Cage, whom he knew and supported as well. But as I said, he was a generous man, and he ran the periodical New Music, which was quite a lot financed by Ives in those years. And so that was the first American composer that I met. And around the same time, I met John Cage. And I think the last time I saw John Cage was in 1990 at a party in New York that was thrown for our visit, and we asked John Cage, and he came. And I played his earliest composition.
And what was that?
That is 3 little songs to Gertrude Stein texts, which can also be played as piano pieces. And when I said something about how pleased I was he was there and how much I admired him and his music, I said that I first met him something over 40 years ago, that I was very pleased to say I have never been the same since. Well, you know, these eccentrics have a habit of moving closer to the center. One only has to think of the reception given to Ives, who was very much on the fringes, hardly performed in the 50s, and now is written about as the greatest American composer. The same applies to a French composer like Erik Satie, whose work has interested me a lot because it's off the main traditions, and now look at the record catalogue, it's simply amazing. He's moved in towards the center. And the same is true of Cage. Look at the record catalogue. Cage's sonatas and interludes for prepared piano, regarded as a kind of lunatic fringe venture, certainly in the British catalogue with nothing much on record 10 years ago. Now, there are 10 different versions of this work. And further, the pieces that give performers an opportunity for doing what they want to do in a flexible way have appealed to a lot of performers, and there are a lot of recordings of those too. As far as my own music's concerned, I didn't go all the way with Cage. I was delighted to come across pieces by Cage and to pick out the sort of thing that I thought I could use. You know what composers are like. Stravinsky said composers are like pigs snouting truffles. And composers go for what they want. If they can find it here, they go there, and they look for that. And I was very happy to get that from Cage. Although I was always sympathetic to Cage's outlook. In 1965, I wrote an article based on interviews with Cage for the British magazine Music and Musicians. And the editor thought it was so crazy that somebody would take this seriously that he insisted on giving it a title, Way Out with John Cage. So that's how it was published. And I kept in touch with John Cage. I made a radio documentary about him in 1990 for BBC, and that was broadcast again with some extra material shortly after his death in 1992. It was a great privilege to meet Hitler. The works for percussion ensemble, the constructions in metal, magnificent pieces that are now entered the repertoire from the later 30s. And there's a huge amount of work for prepared piano, not just a handful of sonatas and interludes. There's a concerto for prepared piano from 1950, which is a fully notated piece. And there are songs, too, to various poets like Gertrude Stein, E. E. Cummings. And then Cage had a fascinating obsession with James Joyce. But the interesting thing is that we shouldn't regard him as just a composer, because he was a writer, some would say a poet, and he also did lithographs. And all of this is very individual, very influential, and therefore the art world respected Cage, and the literature world too. So it's all embracing and very fascinating, I think. It throws open the boundaries for musicians, and composers felt he was a liberating influence. They could do things that they felt they weren't able to do before, because they'd have to write a serious piece and do certain things. And then they could lift these bondages. Yes, they could, yes. When I started my Center for American Music at Kiel in 1974, a senior person in the university administration said to me, "American music? Is there any?" I mean, the ignorance, the crass ignorance, is unbelievable if you only look at musicals and jazz and films and things of that sort.
I've run into that quite a bit in Europe, I must say.
But it's changing so rapidly
I'm sure,
that you can very soon tell them, "I told you so."
Yes.
And we have major classics in 20th century music, from Barber, of course, and Copland, and Bernstein too. There's an enormous amount. Amongst the composers that I met and had a connection with after my time in the US would be Morton Feldman, whom I put on in London in the 60s when he was there for the first time, and he rehearsed my students in his own music. And I kept in touch with him. And I met Virgil Thomson too,
Yes.
who was a great character.
Yes. Can you tell us a little about him?
And the interesting thing is that my sister, who is a singer, Muriel Dickinson, we did a lot of American music, especially around the bicentennial in '76, but before and after. And we did first recordings on a LP called American Anthology of Carter, Cage, Copland, and Thomson.
And those were first recordings?
They were first recordings.
Amazing.
I did the first recording of Copland's last important piece called Night Thoughts. But back to Virgil Thomson. I shall never forget him coming to dinner at my sister's flat in London in order to listen to the test pressing of the record. And he hadn't heard it. He was a bit deaf. He got up the steps onto the 4th floor, rather breathless, and then he wanted to hear the test pressing. We sat him
Right away.
Yes, we sat him with his good ear towards the speakers, and he sat there and listened to Portrait of F.B. and 2 for Marianne Moore. And there was a silence when he'd finished listening, and then suddenly, in his flat Kansas accent, I better try to imitate it, he said, "That's everything it ought to be." And that was the accolade.
That's fantastic from someone who was such a renowned music critic.
He could bite, couldn't he?
Yes. Oh my God! Everybody trembled before.
I gave a paper about his music, and he was there, which was another Thomson ordeal that I passed successfully, because he was very pleased by deduction that his musical technique was an almost exact counterpart of what Gertrude Stein did in her writings. So this was very rewarding, and I would meet him occasionally in London. I think the last time I met him was at the Travellers Club, where he used to stay in London. He was then very deaf, so he talked in a very loud voice. In this old-fashioned English club, people turned around because they were trying to read their newspapers and wondered why this American was declaiming, but he didn't give a damn. Why should he? I think historically his position is related to the operas now. There's 4 Saints in 3 acts, 1934 at Hartford, Connecticut, and then Mother of Us All, and Lord Byron up to a point. But the Gertrude Stein operas are interesting because they seem to make common ground now with what the minimalists have been doing in the theatre, people like Philip Glass. They realized much later, these minimalists, that they had no tradition, because they weren't writing Puccini's sort of opera, were they, Philip Glass and co. They were writing something much closer to Virgil Thomson and his theatre pieces. The latest thing is that Mark Morris's dance company has danced 4 Saints, and the dance in some of these pieces is important. But he is an eccentric figure, and I don't think he'll have the survival value of Copland. But he loved to point out that it was he who taught Copland how to use low-density music for films and how to draw on immediate American experiences like those documentary films, The Plough That Broke the Plains and others in the 30s. So there was a connection there that was fascinating. But I must speak about Copland before we finish. Another great human being. It was an honor to know him and to meet him, and his generosity was truly inspiring. I didn't dare meet him when I was in New York as a student. He seemed such a towering figure. I probably should have done, but when I set up the Center for American Music at Kiel, I think I wrote to him and I said, "I see you're coming to London, I'd love to discuss this with you." So we met for lunch, And I hadn't quite got the lunch arrangements right, so we were walking through the street in probably 1974, and people stopped us because they wanted Aaron Copland's autograph.
Oh my goodness.
You have to remember that he was very celebrated as a conductor then, and could quite a personality, and that was really very, very charming. And then he came to Kiel University in 1976 and stayed with us and gave 2 marvelous interviews to the students. One was in the Moberly Hall at Kiel with an audience of over 400, and he just took questions after Merrill and I had performed the only Dickinson songs, and some other people had played the violin and piano sonata and some other pieces. And he was very, very content and delighted. We put on a special dinner party for him before the concert of about 25 people. And that year, the president of the concert series was the Duchess of Westminster, one of the richest landowners in the country, sort of behind the Queen. And he said to me, no, I said to him, you're going to be sitting next to the Duchess of Westminster. He said, you mean I'm sitting next to a real live English Duchess?
He was impressed, or he was being...
I think he was slightly modest.
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, he knew his own worth. I love this story because coming to Kiel was the American cultural attaché who had written a book about American music. It wasn't very good. It was full of names and dates. And since he was coming, I said to Copland, well, you're going to meet him. And do you know his book? And he thought a minute. He said, oh, yes. I saw it in the bookstore. I took it down from the shelf, and I saw 2 sentences about me. And I put it right back. And he was dead right. I mean, what an insult. 2 sentences in a book on American music about Aaron Copland. It's unbelievable. What a miscalculation. And I used to get some lovely letters from him where he would say, delighted, the Dickinsons have done the Dickinson songs again.
I must ask you about one more figure in American music, Elliott Carter. You also knew him.
I met him earlier because at Juilliard I was in the graduate class of Charles Jones, Canadian composer who lived in New York, a very good teacher. And he asked Elliott to come to the class, and this was 1960 when he was writing his 2nd string quartet.
And he wasn't Elliott Carter yet. I mean, of the fame that he achieved maybe after his 2nd string quartet.
In his early 90s, he's still composing, and it's still very impressive. There's no diminution of creative power. What a story. It's astonishing. So I first met him then, and then kept in touch with him over the years, and our record that I mentioned contained the 3 songs of Robert Frost and Voyage to a poem by Hart Crane. And he was very pleased with these because he hadn't got that much on record in those days, and this was the first recording of those songs. So when William Glock at the Bath Festival put on an American music program that Merrill and I did, we did the Carter songs, and Carter and Helen Carter were there. But we also did our usual kind of American music program that meant there were some songs of Gershwin, some rags of Joplin, and various other things, probably Copland too. And after the concert, Helen Carter said, I'm afraid we don't really like Gershwin very much. And we're not very fond of Joplin. But we loved Elliott's songs. And then we all sat down and did the songs all over again when the audience had gone, especially for her and Elliott. The competition is tremendous. Just imagine the competition for new works. There have never been so many composers. I mean, in America it's absolutely amazing, and they're all over Europe as well, and Japan and Korea. The competition is absolutely colossal. What we've had now is what I would call a cultural fragmentation. The central tradition has virtually collapsed, in that there are now many different kinds of traditions, and these will be affected by methods of communication, in particular the internet, where you can have separate publics for all kinds of things. People can bring out CDs in very small numbers, and they can market them individually without being bothered with the huge administrative paraphernalia. That's one aspect, the technological side of it. The other is the question of popular culture, which I've been discussing here as something that fascinated me, because jazz and African American music comes into the concert hall with Gershwin and the Opera House, and people like Constant Lambert in British music, and Tippett too, and Copland, of course, all of these. Now you move that further along in the 20th century, and the whole business of pop music becomes rock and a teenage culture, and that fuses with minimalism, so you've got composers who are serious about what they're doing, but it has repetitive structures and things of that sort that appeal to a generation reared on a regular beat. So the confusion is very great. And the technological side of it too is that people use music in a particular way. Research on the setting up of Classic FM, our new radio station in England in the early 90s, showed that 90% of the time people had the radio on, they were doing something else. Well, if you use music like that, is it surprising we get music that doesn't need all your attention? It's not like sonatas and symphonies, it's a kind of wallpaper. I have got 2 string quartets. One dates from my time at Juilliard, and the second one, you see how awkward I can be, the second one is for a string quartet with tape playback.
Oh,
And as we were saying earlier, tape playback is a terrible hazard in live concerts, but it's fine for recordings and broadcasts. The second string quartet is also involved with ragtime because the tape playback consists of an incomplete piano rag that gets gradually more complete as this long piece progresses.
Peter, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about the creation of our trio, the American trio, Hymns, Rags, and Blues. It's a fascinating piece. We've enjoyed playing it very much, and we're going to play it tonight and this weekend, so if you could speak about it a little bit, I would appreciate it.
I'm fascinated by the trio. I preferred it to the idea of doing a piano trio because it's got more color, is less thick, I think. I wouldn't always know what to do. I don't think I could write a piano quartet. I don't think I would know how to cope with that many instruments as well as the piano. It's all right for a harmonic composer like Brahms and Schumann. That's fine in that tradition. But I would find it difficult, I think. So that your trio is a kind of airiness and a kind of lightness, and at the same time I hope a soulful expression which is possible from the different ways of playing melodies between the violin and the clarinet, which is what happens. The piano doesn't get much of a look in at this actually in my piece until the end, when the piano has the rag, where you and the clarinet produce disruptive versions of the rag that the piano is playing straight, and eventually, towards the end, of course, at the very end, it harmonizes and fits. It's like a jigsaw puzzle where a child has thrown all the bits on the floor, and then somebody gets together and begins to piece them together, and then finally, maybe at the end of my American trio, the last piece goes in, and it's a G major triad.
Yes. No, it's a lovely piece, and we as you know, we've played it a great deal, and we've always enjoyed doing it, and we're looking forward to doing it again this
Yes,
year.
so am I. Looking forward to it very much.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's a delight to have you here, and thank you for your wonderful piece.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.